So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being with us today. My name is Sheila McIlraith, and I'm a professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto, a candidacy for AI chair at the Vector Institute, and an associate director here at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. On behalf of the Schwartz-Reisman Institute, I'm really pleased to welcome you to our first SRI seminar series event of winter 2025 semester. Whether you participated in past seminars, or if this is your first time joining us, I'm hoping that you find this series to be a welcome and inspiring place to learn more about important research at the intersection of technology and society, and to discuss the societal implications, benefits, and challenges of AI and other technologies. We have an excellent slate of speakers lined up for this term, so I hope that you'll join us not only for the seminar today, but for some of our future seminars as well. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still a home for many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While some of us may be joining from different places today, many of us are, we invite you to reflect on the history and the relations of the land that you are on. Before I turn things over to Chris, I wanted to mention a few logistics for everybody here. This session is being recorded. Our speaker will present for about 50 minutes, and that's going to be followed by a Q&A. During the Q&A, you're all sort of by default muted, but we encourage you to engage, to please do ask questions and to use the raise hand function in Zoom meeting controls, or to type your questions in the chat. And when you're called upon, you'll be unmuted in order to ask your question. So I'd like to now move to introducing our speaker. Chris Summerfield is a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Oxford, and he's also a research director at the UK AI Safety Institute. His research focuses on human cognition, neural function, machine intelligence, and the societal implications of technology. Chris has published over 100 works in leading journals and received several prestigious honors, including the Cognitive Neuroscience Young Investigator Award for his outstanding contributions to the field. He also writes books. So he has a recent book, Natural General Intelligence, which was published in 2022 by Oxford University Press. And he also has a forthcoming title, which I'm actually very curious about, called These Strange New Minds, which is due later this year. So I'm looking forward to that personally. In addition to his research, Chris has held significant service roles in a variety of places. He's chairing the Wellcome Trust's Neuroscience Expert Group, co-organizing the Cognitive Computational Neuroscience Annual Meeting, and founding a summer school on behavioral modeling and serving as an academic editor of PLOS Biology. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chris Summerfield, whose presentation is entitled The Habermas Machine, Using AI to Help People Find Common Ground. Chris, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you for that very generous introduction, and I'm honored to be kicking off your seminar series this winter. I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope everyone can see that. I hope someone will yell at me if you can't see that. Fantastic. So as Sheila said, I have a kind of broad range of interests that sort of span from cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience right through to AI research and its implications for society, the economy, and our democracy. And it's really in that latter bucket that this work was done. It was work done when I was at Google DeepMind, where I was until the end of last year. And I'll acknowledge at the end the amazing team that worked with me on this project. I'm now a research director within a part of the UK government that is responsible for thinking about AI safety, and I lead in that organisation, which is called the UK AI Safety Institute. I lead on the societal impacts of AI. So I'm very much kind of like interested in hearing your feedback and your thoughts about the impacts that AI has on our democracy as a sort of wider topic, because that's kind of core to the work that I'm doing now. So as Sheila said, my talk is entitled The Habermas Machine, Using AI to Help people find a common ground. And so perhaps, a good starting point for this work is the intuition that when we talk about AI and democracy in the same breath, very often we are kind of like we are striking a more pessimistic note than optimistic. And, I think it's fair to say that there's been, there's been a considerable trend in our discourse on this topic, which emphasizes the various ways in which the arrival of powerful AI systems threatens to disrupt our democracies and contribute to democratic backsliding the world over. So that takes various forms. The anthropologist Noah Yuval Harari has famously said, of course, that AI favors tyranny, effectively arguing that AI provides new tools for oppression in authoritarian states. People are worried that AI might be used as a tool for jeopardizing our cognitive autonomy. So we might see the advent of models that are capable of highly persuasive forms of rhetoric that could be deployed at scale to kind of tip the political calculus in ways which are disadvantageous for the wider discourse in the public sphere. It could automate disruption to the key sort of materiality of a democracy. So thinking about those events and processes which are so critical, like the integrity of our elections, for example. And more widely, it might lead to significant changes to the economy and to labor markets, perhaps through concentrating power and capital in the hands of a small number of companies. And of course, that's going to have a destabilizing effect for our democracy as a whole. So there's all sorts of ways, there's all kinds of bad news that AI might bring for democracy. Without kind of diminishing that narrative, which I think is one we should take very seriously, my talk nevertheless wants to emphasize the opposite side, which is the ways in which AI might be, or one way in which AI might be potentially deployed in order to kind of bolster rather than weaken our opportunities for democratic interaction. And the focus specifically is on deliberation. Deliberation in the public sphere, of course, has long been a cornerstone of our democracy, and that finds its expression, of course, in many different ways. So both kind of informally through all the many ways in which we find to engage in political discussion, but then more formally, of course, in vehicles which people have developed as tools for explicit deliberation over, for example, policy initiatives that take the form of things like citizens' juries or are, in some incarnations, deliberative polls in which people get together and formally discuss around the table issues of import in the current day. Now, of course, deliberation is a wonderful thing, but deliberation is, particularly when formalized, it can be very costly. It can be time-consuming, and it's hard to scale. So if you want to get people around the table to discuss, you're limited by the size of your table. And of course, when people do deliberate face-to-face, there is the challenge that perhaps not all voices will be heard equally. Discussion that happens face-to-face is also prone, as a cognitive scientist kind of know well, is prone to a number of biases, well-known cognitive biases and social biases, social desirability effects, things like the fact that we very often, we don't like to lose arguments. We like our voice to be heard. When people do come together to discuss issues, very often they're motivated by a desire to kind of win the argument or to not appear to be foolish, rather than necessarily to perfectly portray what their true viewpoint is. And so the challenge is, how can we build tools that facilitate deliberation, which kind of that might circumvent some of these kind of externalities, whilst remaining true to our desire to allow people to ultimately be able to collectively decide using natural language. And so this project began with the intuition that maybe newly available tools from natural language processing, specifically large language models, might be able to help with that project, with that question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to describe to you the tool that we built. I'm going to explain how it works, and then I'm going to tell you about some experiments that we did involving human participants, both kind of convenient samples and much more carefully selected representative samples of citizens, and how we put this tool through its paces and showed how it might be used to facilitate deliberation. So the basic idea is that we can use a language model as a kind of mediator in a debate among a group of people who are discussing a political, social, or moral issue in which they may be prone to disagreement. And the sort of mediation that we trained the model to engage in is something that has previously been called caucus mediation, sometimes also called the Delphi method, or very similar to that method. And broadly, what happens is that human participants are invited to venture their view on an issue. Here we used political issues that were relevant in the UK, and we used UK-based citizens. That's where we're based at the time. And so people venture their opinion on a political issue, and that serves as an input to the model. The model is then trained to produce a group statement. That's a statement which those particular individuals are most likely to want to endorse. The participants can then view this statement individually, and they can offer a critique of that statement. Those critiques, along with their original viewpoints, are then fed back into the model, and the model then revises the statement to account for those critiques. And this process can continue theoretically as many times as is necessary until there is some sort of agreement over the statement. So what's important here is that we have a group of people who are kind of like they're engaged in a deliberation process, but it's not really like a deliberation process in face-to-face deliberation, because they never actually meet, they never actually interact with each other. What they're doing is they're kind of critiquing a statement which is generated by a theoretically impartial mediator who has access to all of their private opinions. And that mediator is a large language model, and what we're going to try to do, what we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of tools for fine-tuning to and large-scale human data collection to train that model to produce group statements which are as likely as possible to be endorsed by those participants. So that's the overall framework. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit more detail about how it works. So in all of the experiments that I'm discussing today, we have human participants. In most of them, they're recruited online on a crowdsourcing platform. And the actual, under the hood, the actual tool consists of two different language models. One is a generative model that's trained to produce text, and the other is a reward model, which is trained to produce a kind of score, which is proportional to how likely it thinks each individual is going to be to endorse a particular group statement, conditional on that individual's personal, private opinion about the topic under discussion. So let me see if I can unpack this a little bit more. So in the beginning, what happens is, there's a particular issue. Should the UK, lower speed limits on the motorways, for example? It's not a particularly controversial issue in the UK, but at the moment, that's one of our discussion topics. People wrote their private opinion about that topic. That was fed to the generative model, which was trained to produce a statement, group statement, in fact, a number of different sample group statements. Those statements were then fed to the reward model, and the reward model had been trained to assign values to those statements, conditional on each individual's private opinion. So it would essentially say how much each individual would like that statement, conditional on what they had written as their private opinion. Now, it does that for each individual separately. And what that gives us the opportunity to do is to use a social choice function to essentially rank the statements according to a rule which has certain desirable properties. For those of you who know about social choice theory, we actually use the Schulze method, which has some really nice properties, but I'm not an expert on social choice, so I won't try and tell you what they are. That's then fed back to participants who have the opportunity to then rate that statement, and they tell us how much they did indeed like it. We can then, after that, we invite them to write a critique of the statement, which is then fed once again back to the generative model to generate a new prompt, which is again kind of assigned values by this reward model, and then they're again rating the then revised statement. And this could continue for many, many cycles. Actually, in the experiments I'm going to describe, we only did one cycle of critique, partly for expediency, but in theory, you could do much more. And then right at the end, so what I've described here is a general framework that we use both in experiments where we're testing the model and in experiments where we're training the model. When we train the model, of course, at the beginning, we don't have any training data, so the generative model is we're just prompting the generative model to produce a good statement, and actually it does quite a bad job at that stage. But after a while, we've got all of this rating data from participants, so we can use that rating data to train the reward model. So how much people actually say they like the statements then serves as a target for our reward model. It's trained to try and predict that. And after seeing a few thousand of these, or data from a few thousand participants who are discussing each 3 issues, we can then get pretty good predictions out of the reward model. Participants say not only how much they agree with the statement, that's what we use to train the reward model, they also say what sort of quality the statement is. So was it well written? Was it grammatical? Was it sensical? And we use those quality data to train the generative model using supervised fine-tuning. So we've got 2 fine-tuning methods here. Supervised fine-tuning, for those of you who are familiar with this method to train the generative model, and it's like a version of reinforcement learning from human feedback, but it's a bit different because unlike RLHF, as it's used standardly, which basically treats all participants as one sort of macro person, what we do is we condition on private statements. So it's a personalized reward model. And then at the end, we can ask people, kind of which statement do you prefer? We can ask them if they prefer the final best statement. We actually usually ask them if they prefer the final best statement produced after refinement to the final best statement before refinement. So that's the overall setup. And the experiments that I'm going to show you today all are based on that broad framework. So this is just to give you a flavor of kind of like how it feels. So we've got participants typing their opinions like this, and we have a group statement that's generated. And, kind of this, I like this example. I don't have time to sort of read the whole thing out, but kind of you can see from this example group statement already that just anecdotally, it sort of has some kind of desirable properties. So broadly, kind of in this example, we've got 3 participants. We're asking, should we lower speed limits on the roads? And we have 2 participants who sort of broadly say that speed limits are mainly okay. And we have 1 participant that says speed limits should be reduced. And the first thing you notice is that the group statement broadly respects the majority. So we have a 2-to-1 majority saying what's broadly okay, and the statement does that. Now that's desirable, of course, because we're trying to train a democratic process here. It's also expected from the Schulze rule that we use for our social choice theory. But something that the statement already does, you can already see the statement does, which I think is quite nice, is that it also incorporates information from all of the different views, including the minority views. So the minority person here is concerned about things like fuel efficiency and pollution, and the statement incorporates those elements into the statement. And it does so in a way which kind of doesn't slavishly just kind of cut and paste from the participants, but it actually kind of like seamlessly integrates these information from the different perspectives into something which is broadly coherent. And I think it's really important to emphasize here, there's obviously a large literature on using NLP for like opinion summarization and so on. And what we're doing here with our fine tuning, I think, goes quite far beyond just kind of, summarizing the opinions. What it's doing is it's incorporating elements into the statement, which kind of are much they reflect a mixture of the different views that are used. Okay, I see there's some questions in the chat here. Yeah, what does the personalized reward get you that averaging across groups doesn't? Maybe I'll take these questions at the end, because I think they're sort of broader, big picture questions, if that's okay. Okay, so the first experiment that we did was to ask, technically, this actually wasn't the first experiment they did. The first experiment I'm going to tell you about is one in which we asked, kind of, is it the group statement generation process kind of competitive with what you might expect from sort of incentivized humans who are not experts, but who are incentivized to try and do the same task. So in order to do this, what we did was we recruited a bunch of people online, and we paid them we gave them the same task, so they were able to see the opinions written by people, and they were asked to generate a group statement that they thought would kind of be voted for by these participants. And we incentivized them quite heavily through financial rewards. If their statement was chosen, then they got quite a significant financial bonus. And this allowed us to kind of put the statement generated by our language model, which we call Habermas Machine, head to head against that generated by these human mediators. And that allowed us then to compare levels of endorsement for the two. And so that's what's shown on this graph here, the AI mediator in purple and the human mediator in orange. And what you can see is that both were pretty good, right? So we have both a sort of, a majority saying that majority of participants saying that they agree with or strongly agree with the group statements that are written by either the human or the AI. But I think you can see that whereas for the modal response for the human mediators was agree, the modal response for the AI was strongly agree. So we do have a reliable difference between these two. I think, and with the AI being better, I think this is not the most important thing. And I think we can caveat this, our humans weren't professionals, and maybe if we did professionals, humans would be better, and so on. I think the most important take home from this is that the AI is doing at least as good a job as you could expect reasonably motivated and incentivized humans to do. And I'm happy to talk more about how we excluded junk data from the humans to make sure that wasn't driving the effect and so on. Okay, so of course, that's reassuring, but agreement is only one part of what might make a good statement. There are a number of different dimensions you might want your group statement to satisfy to have a good quality on. So you might want it to be clear and informative. Obviously, we want it to reflect the majority to some extent. We want it to avoid having nonsense in it, to avoid using polarizing or biased language. And so on and so on. So we would want, there's a number of different dimensions that we care about. So we also recruited a bunch of third-party raters, and we presented them with statements that were generated both by the model and by humans. And we asked them to evaluate them on these dimensions. I'm actually just showing you data from the model here. Don't worry so much about the difference between the different colors. These are just different versions of the model. But broadly, what you can see is that on the left, where we have statements that have generally undesirable properties, like does not express a collective opinion, contains nonsense, contains biased language, we have general disagreement. And on the right, where we have things that are desirable, things like includes aspects of the minority view, reflects the majority, is clear and informative, we have agreement. And third-party raters actually considered the AI-mediated statements to be more clear and informative than human statements, less illogical, more likely to capture the majority view, and less likely to reflect the opinion of an individual. And I think that last one is very important because this is obviously a challenge when you have a human mediator, particularly in something like a citizens' assembly. It's very difficult. You have to train the human, as many of you will know, train the human extensively to so that they refrain from injecting their own particular views or biases into the process. The model seems to be less prone to do that than our non-expert human mediators. So we have, I've been talking a lot about deliberation. We can, we can argue about whether the process of sort of iterative refinement of the statement is actually deliberation or not. I don't really think it captures what that word means in common parlance, but I think it does have this sort of iterative or iterative refinement element, which is, of course, key to human deliberation. But a pertinent question, of course, is like, does it matter, right? So, did we even need to have that iteration? And so an obvious question is just like, did people prefer the second round statement produced after refinement to the first round statement produced before refinement? And yes, they did. That's reassuring. But of course, that might also just be the effect of a kind of effort justification bias. Maybe people think, well, I just spent longer doing this process, so, I should probably like the end result more. So we ran another experiment in which we had two phases, but in one case, for some questions, the critique that was ventured by participants was incorporated, was fed to the model and incorporated. And in the other case, it wasn't fed to the model. So the model generated a new statement that did not incorporate the critiques. But in both cases, there were two rounds. And you can see that there's a pretty, again, a fairly reliable bonus for the critiques being incorporated. So this shows that the model is kind of capable of taking the critiques and refining the statement in a way which is likely to garner higher levels of endorsement over iteration. We didn't do more rounds, but I think we would have got more benefit if we had. Okay, so I've described the overall setup, but at the end, and we had this survey at the end, but both before and after the entire experiment, we also asked participants another question. That is, we asked them for their initial and final stance on the issues which were under discussion. So in our kind of motorway example, for the entire experiment, we asked them, do you actually think that we should reduce the speed limits on the motorway? And at the end, we say, what do you think now? So this affords us the opportunity to ask whether people's views change over the course of the deliberation process. These are just three different experiments, all with sizable cohorts. And what you can see is that what's plotted on the y-axis here is a measure of group agreement. So this is literally just the percentage of people that fell on the majority side of the argument, both before and after the deliberation process. And what you can see is that in all three experiments, it grows reliably from pre to post. So in other words, the model is not only that people endorse the statement, it's that if you measure their stance before versus after, it's actually generating agreement. And this was the justification for the title of our paper about finding common ground. So we argue that the model actually helps people find common ground, as demonstrated by the increase in the number of people who kind of agree or fall on the majority side of the argument. You might say, well, how do you know your model has anything to do with this? There's an awful lot happening. People are exposed to each other's views, if only through the medium of this group statement. Maybe it's just the mere fact of deliberating means that people kind of tend to agree. So we ran a control experiment in which rather than using the language model to generate this group statement, we just exposed people to each other's opinions. So everyone saw everyone else's opinions. And what we found was that in that case, there was no change in the level of agreement. So it does seem like it's something to do with the generation of the group statement. We didn't do this for the human mediators, though, so we don't know whether the model would have done better than the humans on this measure. So I've told you two things. I've told you that the model generates statements that people are likely to endorse, and I've told you that their views change so that there's more agreement on the stance after than before the deliberation process. What I haven't told you is whether those two things are linked, and that's what's shown on this slide. So what we do here is we use a regression analysis to try to understand the determinants of belief change in each individual from pre to post. So specifically what we do is we try and predict their stance after the debate. This is for each individual in the group. I should have said, sorry, the groups are quite small. There's only 4 or 5 people in each group. And what we can do is we can take so we can take their, as a dependent measure, we can take their belief or take their stance on the issue after deliberation, and we can try and predict it as a function of a number of other different quantities, including prominently, for example, their stance prior to the deliberation. So you can see, as shown in this, the dot that has the 3 red stars on the left, you can see that people's stance prior to deliberation strongly predicts their stance after deliberation, which kind of makes sense. You know, people have a certain level of intransigence. But we can also ask how their stance after deliberation is predicted by other people's stance before deliberation or after deliberation. And interestingly, what we find is that there isn't really any predictive power for people's other pre or other post, do not predict people's belief after deliberation. So you might think this is a bit surprising. So how is it that, you know, kind of like there's agreement is generated? But it turns out that what is significant is this interaction term, which is the level of agreement or endorsement that someone gives to the statement and the extent to which the views of others influence their choice, influence their stance. So in other words, the endorsement of the group statement is a mediating variable for the influence of others' views on your own views. So that's exactly what you'd want, right? So you'd want the statement to be something that helps you accommodate other people's views in your own. That's the definition of an agreement finding process. And as I said, we've run 3 different experiments. We've actually run many more, but these are we get the same result every time. And you can see that in all of them, this is reliably the case. So the wonderful thing, of course, about language modeling is it gives us this really amazing opportunity to take text, which is a kind of idiosyncratic high-dimensional object, and turn it into numbers that we can then subject to kind of rigorous multivariate analysis to try and understand, you know, kind of how in the context of this study, trying to understand how people's views change over time. And so we availed ourselves of this opportunity. And there's a kind of cool thing that you can do with the data that we have. It's obviously very, very rich. But specifically, you know, because we have this kind of each issue that people are debating is defined by a stance. So you could say, yes, I agree with X, or no, I don't agree with X. What we can do is we can take advantage of tools from NLP that will turn those statements into high-dimensional vectors. And I can, here specifically, we're using a tool that Google built called a T5 sentence encoder. And so we can take each issue and we can embed it such that agree is one vector and disagree is another vector. And what that means is that there's an axis, high-dimensional axis, which links those two. And we can then take all the opinions, private opinions, and the group statements that people wrote or that are generated by the model, and we can project them down onto that axis. And that projection should reflect, to some extent, the extent to which that either opinion or group statement falls closer to the agree or disagree end of the spectrum. And that actually works, and that's what's shown on the right of this slide here. So what we've done here is we've taken that embedding value. So we've now reduced this down to a sort of single position on this axis. And we correlated against the stance Likert rating that people give at the end of the experiment. And we can see that there's a decent correlation. So in other words, kind of if I write, no, I don't think we should lower the voting age or lower speed limits on the motorways, my running example. And when I embed that on this stance axis, which is using this sentence encoder, then I get a value which is correlated with a reply to the Likert rating, which asks me what I think about that issue at the end of the experiment. So with this, we can do a whole bunch of interesting stuff. So the first thing is we can just examine what happens over the course of the debate, what happens to the statements which are written by people and generated by the model, particularly here are generated by the model. What happens to them over the course of discussion, both in terms of where they lie on this axis and where they lie on a kind of residual axis, which is just the axis orthogonalized with respect to that stance axis. And that's what's shown here. And what you can see is that, so in orange, we have the pre-critique candidates. So that's the first round candidates generated by the model. And then purple, we have the winning statement. So this is the kind of like the thing that came out the other end of the model. And you can see that it changes in two really important ways. So the first thing is that it kind of squashes around the middle. Now that's what you would expect if effectively what the model is doing is finding some sort of good compromise solution, right? So you would expect that if there's, initially the statements would be more all over the place, and then in the end, it's going to converge to something which is more kind of reflective of the average view of participants. And that's certainly what happens. But you can also see that really importantly, it moves in a residual direction as well. And we don't actually know what that residual direction is, but it's something which is very important for the success of the model. And I show this by way of showing that the model is doing more than just kind of like finding if you like, a good compromise. It's not just kind of averaging people's opinions in the stance space. It's doing something which is residual to that as well. Sorry. So yeah, so this is just supposed to illustrate this. So, kind of sorry, no, I forgot what I was going to say, forgive me. So we can also do something else with this. And very importantly, we can use this type of approach to try and understand whether the model is giving due weight to people who lie on both the majority and the minority side of the argument. So this is a little bit technical, so I'm just going to take a minute to unpack it. So what I've shown at the top of the slide here is it's like a representation of where different group members, shown in blue, might lie on a particular stance axis, let's say from agree to disagree. And you see we've got 5 people in the group, 3 of them on one side, 2 of them on the other. So we've got a majority side and a minority side. And so what we can do is we can then ask, we can look at what the group statement, we can measure the group statement that the model generates projected down onto this axis. And we can say, where does that group statement lie in relation to the minority side and the majority side? So you can imagine that, for example, if what the model was doing was just ignoring the minority and placing the statement in the mean of the majority, then the orange dot would be kind of in the middle of these 3 dots on the left. If it could alternatively just be finding the geometric mean of everyone, right? So it could just be finding the average of everyone. That would just be a compromise solution. Alternatively, it could be slightly biased towards the minority. And in fact, that is what we find. So we actually use a regression method, like a kind of constrained regression method, to assign weights to the majority and the minority. And so on average, because of the variable group numbers, it's not exactly the weight given to the minority would be 0.25 if we had groups of just 4 people, but we don't. So you can see that the bar plots below, the fact that these 2 bars on the right are higher than the dashed line, which actually lies at about 0.27, which would be the unbiased weight, that indicates that at the end of the process, the model is giving more weight than it should to the minority viewpoint. So in other words, what the statement is learned to do, which my colleagues who work in the field of deliberative democracy tell me that is what you should get out of good citizens jury is that although the statement respects the majority, because it should, it prominently incorporates elements of the minority. And in fact, it overweights those elements, presumably in order to ensure that those who are on the minority side of the argument feel heard, don't feel disenfranchised by the process, and feel like they've made a contribution. So that's something that we thought was really interesting. You can, of course, do other tricks with this as well. So you might ask, there's been a lot of publicity, as many of you will know, about the supposed political leanings of various language models. This is normally, of course, surfaces after like so-called safety fine-tuning, which they tend to adopt more kind of left-leaning or what deemed to be more left-leaning perspectives. We can use the same weighting approach because we actually measured people's, along with demographic information, we measured people's party political affiliations within the UK system. We classified them broadly into kind of favoring right-wing versus left-wing parties in the UK. And this gave us the opportunity to ask whether in the statement, the model is kind of giving more weight to the views of those people who favor right-wing parties over left-wing parties. And to our relief, what we find, what's shown on this plot, is that there's no deviation from the kind of average here. So in other words, the model seems to be giving appropriate weight to people irrespective of their reported political leanings, which is, I guess, a desirable property. Yeah. Okay, so everything I've told you about so far was done with a convenient sample. So we use Prolific Academic, which is a great platform for running experiments. It's very convenient, but of course its participants not necessarily representative. They tend to be younger, they tend to be more tech savvy, and so on. So we partnered with a wonderful organization called Sortition Foundation, and Sortition helped us recruit a cohort of about just over 200 demographically representative UK citizens. This is quite a challenge because we're working with people who are elderly, people who have disabilities, people whose access to technology is kind of different from yours and mine. And but nevertheless, we were able to run a process over a number of different weeks in which groups of people got together and they debated 9 key issues that faced the UK. This was in 2023. We ran this. The core issues at that time, they're probably still the core issues, are things like immigration, prisons, net zero, Brexit, technology, the minimum wage, the retirement age, people's sense of national pride, and childcare policies. These were the issues I think they were identified by YouGov as the main issues at the time. And critically, what we can do now is we can get each group debates more than one. So each issue is debated by multiple groups. And this is actually really interesting because it gives us the opportunity to evaluate, retest reliability of the direction of travel of opinions over independently sampled groups. And that's going to be very interesting. So this is all run online, of course, using exactly the same setup that I've just described to you. This is just a flavor of some of the results. And what you can see is that actually across groups, for many groups, we actually had a kind of common direction of travel. So what that means is that although these groups were independently and randomly sampled, people got together and debated in concert with our tool, with the Habermas Machine, on issues such as, for example, should we be trying to reduce the number of people in prison? What we find is that groups tended to converge on a kind of common perspective, a common change in stance, meaning that, for example, they were more likely to support that issue, that particular issue. They did think we should reduce the number of people in prison after debating the issue than before. And this is just a note about the reason I've been saying all the way through this tool is called the Habermas Machine. The reason we call it that is because we began with the intuition that maybe Habermas, of course, famously said that, if you create like the right conditions for debate, so what he called the ideal speech situation, then, kind of rational individuals who are able to debate freely and as equals should essentially arrive at the same conclusion. That, in other words, that thorny political, social, and moral issues actually have a right answer if only we create the right conditions for debating. Now, of course, I wouldn't wish to make that a claim so bold, but the idea that there is a common direction of travel in this stance when you create these kind of fair and evenly balanced debating conditions stripped of social desirability biases is, I think, kind of really reassuring. I just want to point out of these issues in which we didn't see movement in a common direction on all issues. On things like Brexit, people didn't change their view at all, which is probably to be expected. Obviously people in the UK still very divided, very entrenched over that issue. So I've said this already. So Habermas famously said, inclusive, critical discussion, free of social and economic pressures, treat each other as equals. We should be able to reach a common understanding. So, I would love that to be true. I'm sure we can debate whether it is true. And of course, I know that that particular claim has been subject to really important criticism. But it's an idea that, I think we can at least entertain. Okay, so I've just got a few reflections in closing. These are kind of these are broader reflections about technology and its uses. And it's also, kind of what we should be doing as well, some reflections of what we should be doing. So I think one take home from this project for me, which is a technical take home, is that fine-tuning really matters. Doing good fine-tuning from bespoke data is the way to get language models to do really cool stuff. And, I think that that's coming home to us now. We know that kind of like we've basically trained our language models, our state-of-the-art frontier models are essentially trained on the whole of the internet already. There isn't really that much more useful data that we can scrape. We want our models to get good. Of course, we can give them better reasoning, as we've seen with O1 and now O3 from OpenAI. But what we really need is good quality data. And, kind of like, in the natural science, this shouldn't be a surprise to us, right? In the natural sciences, we don't do research by just like voraciously reading the internet. We do research by like going out and finding new observations and incorporating them into our knowledge base. And we want those new observations or data to be high quality. And I think the same is true in AI. And what we did here was, we went out and we collected large data sets of people's opinions and good quality ratings, and we got that to train the model. And I think that's why it was successful. And I actually didn't tell you about them, but we have a whole bunch of ablation studies which show that the reward modeling in particular is really, really, really important for the success of our model. And if you remove that component, it's much, much worse. Sorry, this is actually my second reflection. So so the reward modeling really made a difference. So the different colors which I showed on one of my earlier plots actually were models with different sorts of ablation. So the proportion of rounds won by the model that had both the SFT and reward model, or the reward model only, was greatly more the models that lacked the reward model. So, kind of RL and doing RL, which is personalized to individuals, is a really, really powerful tool for generating high quality outputs. And we've subsequently we've subsequently done a test in which, this project began 2022. At the time, I know it seems like it wasn't that long ago, but at the time, the state-of-the-art model in Google's state-of-the-art model was Chinchilla. It's a 70 billion parameter model. I know it seems like Stone Age these days. That's the base model that we used. And right at the end of the project, actually in response to a reviewer's request, we tested whether prompting Gemini, which is like a much larger, more powerful model built by Google, would give us the same results. And actually, it was appreciably worse. So fine-tuning a bad language model is a much better way to get this to work than to prompting a much more modern, successful language model. So that's very interesting, I think. My third reflection is about alignment. So, kind of, we talk a lot about alignment, but I think that very often the discourse is kind of mired in some relatively shallow conceptions of what that means. So we often think about value alignment as an imitation learning problem. We want machines that think and learn like us. But, kind of, I think we are this project, which is of course about collective deliberation, really exposes the limits of that viewpoint. Kind of, there is no us. There is no one set of values that we all hold. We're, of course, a plural society with plural values. And, in my view, I think what we need to think about is human machine coordination in the same way we think about human social organization. It's a mechanism design problem. And, there will be desirable and undesirable equilibria, and we need to find those desirable equilibria. And I think we need to start thinking about alignment in that way. I think there's a direction of travel in that direction, but I worry that alignment is still about, can we make machines that are just like people? I think we don't need machines that are like people. I think, in fact, but for years, my preferred way of thinking about AI in general, I think is a bit different from the status quo. I think we've inherited a legacy of thinking about AI as an agent. I think we should stop thinking about AI as an agent. We should think about AI as an institution. And AI is like an institution. It has rules, it has principles, and we interact with it. We people interact with it kind of in the same way that we interact with institutions and not like other people. And I think that's my last point. We already have lots of people on the planet. We don't need more people. What we need is good systems for human social organization. And I hope that technology, amazing advances in AI technology that we've seen over the past decade, I hope that they can help with that. So these are, if you're interested, of some further reading. So this is the paper which came out in Science magazine just a few months ago, with a bunch of colleagues, both from industry and academia and civil society. I've written a broader piece, which is about AI and democracy. It's on arXiv if you're interested. And I really just want to flag in closing the amazing team that made this possible, in particular, Michiel Bakker and MH Tesla, who both work at Google, and who were really the absolute, kind of like day-to-day inspiration for every good design choice, every good conceptual choice really came from them. A bunch of amazing, too many people to name, but a bunch of amazing other people that contributed to the project. Thank you to them, and thank you very much to all of you for listening to my talk.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Chris. That was a fantastic talk. We're now transitioning to the question and answer period or discussion period. And just a reminder to everybody who's with us that you can ask a question by raising your hands or by using the chat function in Zoom. And we welcome you also to please turn on your cameras, those of you who feel comfortable doing so that we have much more of a social discussion here. And if you are, when I call upon you, somebody will turn on your audio for you. So, boy, we've got lots of questions. Let's see whether the raise hand function gives me a fair way to decide who gets to speak first. Okay, so just scrolling up to the top. So Mitchell, perhaps you can ask the first question.
Great, thanks. I will try to be brief given the time constraints and the mass of people who want to chat.
Actually, we've got lots of time, so yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, then I won't be too brief. Chris, thanks for this. This is excellent. I feel like I could ask you a million questions about this, about all aspects of it, but I'm just going to settle on one for now. And it's going to sound like a little bit of a loaded question, but I think it's reasonable. And I wonder, is this a Habermas machine or a Riker machine? And by Riker, I refer to the political scientist and public choice theorist William Riker, who basically diverged from Habermas in what he thinks the role of debate is in political arenas, in that he thinks that debate is more about building off of the idea of the chaos theorems from public choice theory about how that there is a cycling when in group decision making processes, Arrow's theorem, all this kind of stuff. This idea that what debate fundamentally does is it allows a kind of skilled manipulator, essentially, the ability to creatively bundle high dimensional issue spaces into a kind of policy bundle that will pass a kind of a 50% vote or whatever voting threshold is, right? And I wonder, I mean, like what you're doing here is really cool, but I wonder, as opposed to kind of a Habermasian perspective of what deliberation debate is doing, in which that, people are coming with a diverse view, very many diverse viewpoints, and they kind of synthesize a kind of a new kind of shared perspective. And this is what the deliberative theorists kind of talk about as like the holy grail of deliberative institutions, versus the kind of more economics kind of rational choice idea of, we have there are some people who are skilled at manipulating the issue space to their benefit and taking advantage of this kind of really high dimensional kind of complicated space and this kind of cycling problems in public choice to get what they want down on the page and get what they want passed. And
Yeah.
I wonder what you're doing. I wonder, is what you're doing here creating the essentially setting the stage for AI models to be able to do that kind of high dimensional learning of like, what are people's various preference orderings, and kind of, based at least somewhat on its own preferences, is able to kind of manipulate the agenda space towards its own ends. So thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really great question. So yeah, I don't know Reichert. I think that the answer to the question of, is the model kind of Machiavellian in the sense, is probably not, because there's no incentive for it to be, given the cost function that we give it, right? So there isn't. One thing that's really important, and this is a major limitation of our work as well, is that we only evaluate the model in what I call low stakes settings, right? So, kind of, there is absolutely, none of our experiments are incentive compatible. People have no reason whatsoever to, kind of to truthfully report their viewpoint, other than, kind of like it's the social dynamic of the experiment, right? So you could imagine contrasting that with a setting in which there's some real bargaining or negotiation or going on, in which something is at stake for the users, right? And under that, the statement itself would actually need to pass some like threshold, depending on what your choice rule is, pass some threshold level of endorsement. And you could imagine that there would, under certain cost functions, you might get that kind of Machiavellian behavior. So, kind of like, the setup of our experiment doesn't seem to lend itself to that type of behavior. Would you expect gradient descent to give you that in the round? Probably yes, right? And, I think that's really, really important. But, I guess that doesn't always have to be a bad thing, right? I guess that, if what you're looking for is like bipartisan consensus on tricky issues, then maybe, kind of like cleverly wordsmithing your consensus, or the bundle of different policy proposals that go into, kind of a bill, for example, maybe that actually is something desirable if there's a cost to that bill not passing through disagreement. In the end, collective action requires us to agree, right? And, there are definitely cases where it's always going to be better to agree on something which is not ideal than to not agree at all. But thanks, I love your question. I'm going to look up Reichert. I told you I'm a neuroscientist. I don't really know anything about social science.
Moving on, Max, why don't you ask your question? Thanks for the great question, Mitchell.
Hey, Chris, good to see you. I think I'll put in two questions. So first one is just a technical one, which is, what do you get out of averaging out of the personalized reward model versus averaging across all the groups? And then the second one would be, I'd be interested if you could give a vision for what it looks like to deploy this and what the actual form factor is across society to get this type of technology. Yeah. Like, is it a superhuman, like, agreement finder? Is it like very cheap deliberation engines? Yeah.
So could I ask you a question, clarification on your first point? So what would averaging look like? So you mean, what would you get? I'm not, because we didn't do this. I'm not quite sure how you would do it. So how would you, what would you do in order to get a model that produced something that was sort of like the perfect average of how would you, what would that baseline look like?
Maybe I don't fully understand the setup, but I had some impression that instead of like having a model, like if you do normal LHF, right, you just have like a pool of raters, yeah, and then you have pairwise preferences, and you get a model to just learn like, yeah, the pairwise preferences, and that would just like, do you do that with like a sample distribution of raters? Yeah, but I was under the impression you had some like goal conditioned or something was conditioning the reward model.
No, that's absolutely right. So yeah, so I guess the nearest comparison that we have is when you don't do the RLHF, right? So if you just prompt the model to generate, or you just use supervised fine tuning to generate like statements that are conditioned on, they're not conditioned on the individual values, but they're just the statements that the generative model is trained to produce that, kind of will broadly satisfy the group consensus. That's probably the closest we can get. I think that my claim that the model is doing more than averaging probably rests more firmly on the kind of like embedding analyses that we did than any controls that specifically spoke to that. I think it's fairly convincing evidence that it's not just averaging, and that it does better because it's not just averaging. But yeah, we haven't formalized that control except for those ablation analyses that I described.
I think maybe I just didn't understand what you meant by like personalized reward model in the description.
Yeah, so specifically what it means is that, you give the model essentially has multiple heads to it, right? Mm-hmm. And it learns a predictive value for each. You can think of it as kind of operating through different channels, right? It learns a predictive value conditioned on this particular private statement that this particular person has written. How much will they like that statement, and not how much will everyone like that statement? Your second question is a great one. Yeah, and it's one we've thought a lot about. I mean, there are many, many possible uses. I mean, there are very prosaic uses, like, at the moment when we want to do like, public opinion research, we generally still use like Likert scales and radio buttons and things. And like, for my, obviously what we really want to know is like just what people think, right? And of course, NLP gives us the opportunity to do that aggregation. The reason we use numbers is because you can aggregate numbers easily, but now we can aggregate text, right? So, kind of that's an obvious opinion. But I think, beyond the things that I would really like to see it used for, beyond just giving our political leaders a better sense of what people think, which is, I think, really important, is these high stakes situations. There must exist somewhere a version of a climate change bill that, people in most countries can get behind, right? That is a net improvement over whatever policy they have right now. Like, probably the major impediment to that bill passing is we just don't know what goes into the bundle that will satisfy everyone. So maybe you could use a tool like this to find out, right? And then maybe you could propose that bill and maybe it will pass. So that's the sort of thing that, I imagine it used for. Max, it's great to see you.
Great, thanks, Max. Adam, you're up next. Well, we're next.
Thank you, Chris. That was a very cool talk. I really like your design. It's very cool how you did the work to do the comparison to human moderators. That's really useful information to see. And just for myself and related to my own work, I'm really interested in your approach to self-improving the system, to have its own feedback mechanisms, that humans didn't have to intervene to improve these models and such, as I'm understanding it. I'm wondering if it's possible to quickly flip back to the slide with the architecture that you had up. I have some quick questions about that.
Certainly. Maybe this is good enough. Will that do? This one here?
We're not seeing your screen.
Oh, do I need to re-share my screen, perhaps?
Yeah, why don't you try? Yeah, thanks.
Does that work?
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind, I would love to know quickly just some of the nuts and bolts of the implementation of this in terms of models involved, inputs, outputs, what the fine-tuning process, broadly speaking, looks like. So, for instance, the model that generates the initial consensus statement, is that, you said you're using a 70 billion parameter model for the reward model. I presume that's some kind of llama, probably?
No, so this work was done at Google DeepMind, and around 2022, the sort of state-of-the-art model that we had access to for external-facing work that was potentially external-facing was Chinchilla, which is a sort of much older language model. We actually used, I think there's a 70 billion parameter model for the generative model, which is obviously kind of the trickiest part. It's actually got to produce the text. We subsequently found that the reward model, you could do it with a smaller model. So we used 7 billion parameter model for the reward model. Yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of technical details. Maybe rather than listing them all here, I could refer you to the paper where they're probably going to be described much more accurately than I could kind of enumerate here. But if there was anything specific that was kind of like essential for your understanding of the, what it all means, I'd be happy to elucidate.
Okay, maybe I'll jump to kind of the crux of my own personal interest beyond the theoretical stuff, which is super interesting. But basically, just like yesterday, I was using an LLM to do classification on human conversations. And so I just wanted something quick and dirty, used GPT, and via the GPT API, just said, I want you to classify things this way, and then gave it some exemplars, and then it would give me classifications that are of who knows how good a quality. I'm vetting them, and it's okay. And then I found doing this kind of thing that I can actually improve the quality of the classifications substantially if I just give it more exemplars. If I find that it did a poor job with one specific exemplar, I put that in the conversation context and give it the correct classification of that, and then append whatever comes next onto that. So this is not, as I understand it, this isn't technically fine tuning. It is by having those exemplars, those pre-prompts, that is changing the distribution of what it's going to be sampling from in some way or another. And so I guess it's not technically fine tuning in the like LoRa kind of approach. But I'm wondering at what point do you reach kind of the break-even point of it being worth it to set up a proper fine tuning approach versus using just kind of pre-prompting exemplars, that kind of thing, which you can substantially improve the output of these models.
I think this is really an open question. I think everyone has a viewpoint on this. I can tell you mine. I think fine-tuning from high quality data, particularly high quality human data, does make a big difference. But of course, as you described, few shot prompting is going to be better than zero shot prompting. And the more exemplars you have, I mean, this is the nature of in-context learning, right? The more exemplars you have, then the better job, the more information the model has in order to do a really good job of inferring, the type of answer that you're looking for, right? So yeah, I mean, our ablation studies, like I said, suggest that it is better to have a smaller fine-tuned model than a larger and more powerful prompted model. That's true for our problem case. It might not be generally true. My suspicion is that it is probably, generally the case that, and if you think about how humans work as well, kind of we get better when we have lots and lots of experience with particular domains. It takes a long time to train to be, kind of like a doctor or a teacher, and you keep on getting better at these things over lots and lots of examples and lots and lots of experience. And, no matter how smart you are, very few people are able to just take a handful of samples of experience and then generate ones which are kind of in distribution. And, I think just in principle, fine-tuning should be better. But as I said, people have different views. And I'm not, I am not the world's foremost expert on this question. So you'd be much better placed to ask other people, I think. Thanks for the question, Adam.
Nizar, you're up next. Thanks.
Hi, thanks a lot, Chris, for this great presentation. I had been meaning to, check out this paper for a long time. And then I checked out, and then I saw that this presentation was being given. So it's great to be here. My question is actually a refinement of the question that Max asked, or maybe like the question that he wanted to ask, which is, so in the reward model generates this individualized rewards, and then these are being converted to ordinal rankings, which is then fed into, I believe, Schultz rule. And so I was wondering, like, since you are starting with cardinal rewards, why convert them to ordinal rankings and then use an ordinal social choice rule? Why not just directly feed the cardinal rewards into a cardinal social choice rule? And one, such rule which Max mentioned is just kind of choosing as the winner the statement that has the highest average individualized reward, right? So just the kind of the highest total score. But you can also do a lot of the other methods and maybe even use like more proportionally fair cardinal social choice method. So I don't know if, I know that you mentioned that you are not the expert on social choice, but Yeah, but I was
I'm going to be
wondering.
out of my. I'm going to dodge this question. At risk of appearing to kind of pontificate about things that I'm not an expert on. So I really don't know a lot about the social choice. So many of you will know the work of David Parks, who's a co-author on this paper, and so we worked with David to identify the desirable properties of the social choice function. And we considered many different options and we tried out different stuff and we landed on the Schulze method. And so Michiel, who's the co-lead on this, really worked with David on that. So if you really want to know the answer to that question, kind of like it's a great question, but you would be better to ask him because I really just wouldn't be able to give you a well-informed answer.
Okay, then maybe I can sneak in another question that might be a little bit kind of closer to what you are thinking about, which is so you may be aware of Ariel Prokacha's work on generative social choice, and I think that one thing that it does so excellently is that even though we cannot really derive any formal guarantees on what LLMs are doing, we can kind of derive some guarantees on the final output, conditioning on some assumptions on how well the LLM is doing. And so here, for example, we have all these nice properties of Schulze's method, but that those are only as a function of the candidates that it's being provided, which are the statements generated by the generative model, right? And I was wondering if you had given any thoughts on making some assumptions on how good these generative statements are, and then providing, basically based on those assumptions, providing an end-to-end guarantee on whether how close the kind of this group statement is to the best possible group statement that you could have ever produced out of the infinite space of all possible statements.
Yeah. No, that's a really super question. Yeah, I mean, obviously, so I love Ariel Prokacha's work in this area. It's a really, really nice paper. And what's particularly nice is the attention to detail and the guarantees that are given in the social choice function, which like for us is just kind of like a cog in the machine, but for them is kind of like, because of the orientation of that group and their focus is really like actually, deeply at the heart. Yeah, I think, kind of another way of framing your question, maybe in terms which were more how we were thinking about it, is like, kind of like, what are the real limits on this process? Like, is the main limit noise in the reward? Is it just that we don't have a good enough estimates of people of people's rewards? Like, is the reward model, or is it a fundamental limit on the generative capability of the generative model? And I think that is a really, I mean, that question plays out, it's a really fascinating question, plays out in real debate as well, right? Like, how much of the limit of us, of our ability to make progress through collective deliberation is given by our lack of imagination relative to our sheer pig-headedness. That is the problem, right? And like, I think it probably depends on the domain, right? There probably are domains where we can really come up with like, genuinely new generative solutions. And everyone will be like, whoa, I never thought of that, but that's amazing. How much can language models engage in that process? Well, I mean, my personal view is that current language models, I am a firm believer in the astonishing compositional power of these tools. I am not yet fully convinced that they can use those compositional powers to go sort of wildly off manifold to generate like, kind of like incredibly new solutions that, humans wouldn't necessarily have thought of. So, Again, I'm sorry, I'm sort of dodging your question. I don't know the answer to what the limits are, but I think this is a really, really fundamental issue, not just for this work, but actually for a whole category of uses of language models that are similar to this.
I agree.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Nizar. I agree with Chris's statement. I'm now going to just note that we have about 15 minutes left and we have 5 people patiently waiting with their hands up. So maybe we can both the questions and the answers can be brief so we can get to Avery, who's the last one on my list of people with hands up. So, okay, Steve, you're next.
Okay, I'll try to be quick about this. So we're working a lot with AI in the education world, where I really think of it in terms of a Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift that is really changing the way we do things. When I think of your work, I'm thinking are you really going after how we reach consensus decisions? Is this about debating, or is this an alternative to debating? And so I was imagining, what would be a use case? Well, you're a chair of a department, you have a new faculty position, when you bring it in front of the group, everybody's going to want their group to get a new faculty position. But if you had them go through all of this ahead of time online, and you had this now generic statement that the model has produced, is the notion we're trying to get rid of, because we've seen debate doesn't work so well, right? We look at political debate, it's personal, it's heated, it gets, stupidly immature at times. Might this be an alternative where you say, hey, let's start the meeting with this?
Yeah,
Anybody
I think
have
absolutely.
any major objection to that? And so that you're sort of getting rid of the debate process and trying to get to a suitable end much quicker.
So colleagues who work in deliberative democracy would endorse part of what you've said, and I think reject other parts of it, right? So what I, and I agree with them in this, that I would wholly endorse the sort of complementarity of what we have done to face-to-face deliberation, right? So it is a different beast, and I think it has some desirable properties, which, as you noted, are kind of absent from the heated, kind of often counterproductive face-to-face deliberation that we tend to have, either, in faculty meetings and on social media alike sometimes, right? So that is definitely true. On the other hand, kind of like there are, people who work day to day with deliberation as a tool for democracy, I think really think of it not just in terms of like the quality of the output, but in terms of like the benefits to the users themselves. And I think they think a lot about the sort of epistemic benefits to people who are engaged in the deliberation itself. And I think it's really important to note that that is kind of absent from our process, right? People who go into a debate about an issue with kind of like others in good faith learn from that process. They benefit from that process personally. They probably, there are sort of affiliative things that happen which are really beneficial. None of that happens in our machine. Yeah. And I think, when I speak to deliberative democracy crowd, this is all what they focus on. They're like, but, what's the benefit to the user? I'm like, why does that matter? And then they told me. So, kind of, I think there's a part of what you said that makes a lot of sense to me. And there's another part which, like, maybe I have some more skepticism about. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thanks. Ella, you're up.
Hello, thank you. Thank
Hi,
you
Ella.
for this speech. Actually, I have a very short question. I'm not sure. It's coming to a consensus. Either it's a good consensus or like how much you evaluate that consensus. And you said it's perfect averaging, but then there was a discussion about tending to minority. So I don't get what do you mean by perfect averaging if it tends somehow to minority.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you for this question.
Thank you.
I heard two questions, and I'm going to try and answer them both. The last question is the easier one to answer, which is around the technical question of what it does. So the model does not do perfect averaging. It does overweight the minority. And in my view, that is a desirable property, because if you're going to, if you're in a debate and you're on the losing side of the debate, I think it's really important that somehow your contribution to that debate is nevertheless reflected. If it's just kind of completely discounted as if you may as well not have been there, then why would you even show up to the debate next time? And so I think that overweighting of the minority is a good thing. It felt like your first question is like, overall, is like finding consensus a good thing or a bad thing? And I think that is a very, very deep question. And I think, kind of like we deliberately did not put any guardrails into the machine. So the machine is not steering the consensus towards things that are truthful or less harmful. So what that means is if you have a bunch of people who have toxic views and they use this tool, you'll get toxic views out the other end, right? And that's a very deliberate choice on our part, not because we endorse those toxic views, but because ultimately we believe that the democratic process has to be unbiased. And in particular, it should not be biased by the views of people who work in big tech, which was us at the time. So that's why we made that choice. But we've only got limited time, but we could have a much more detailed discussion about that. And actually, we have a paper coming out which is much more discursive, which talks about some of those issues.
Thanks, Ella.
Thank you.
Tomas?
Hi, Chris. Well, thank you for the great talk and the great work. A short question. How robust is the Habermas machine to exaggeration in participants to move the statement towards their viewpoint?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a super question. So obviously, kind of like in any bargaining process, kind of individuals may be incentivized to strategically exaggerate their position in order to have more leverage over the process, right? And this is what we do all the time in face-to-face debate, right? We want to win the argument, we adopt a position which is more extreme than the one we really believe, and then, kind of like the compromise ends up favoring us rather than the other. The main guard against that in our machine, which I think is, it's stronger than in face-to-face debate, is the fact that the participants do not know what the views of the others are. And obviously they can infer them somewhat from the interim group statements, but they never see the private opinions. And so what that means is, kind of like, if I have a particular view on this issue, if I strategically exaggerate my view, I don't know because I don't know what view the other people have. I may actually be pushing the compromise away from my desired position rather than towards it. So under reasonable assumptions, it's actually much less advantageous to engage in this sort of strategic types of behavior than it would be in the face-to-face case where I know what your viewpoint is and I just want to exaggerate mine away from it so that I win. Thank you.
That's such a great advantage. I agree. Sean.
Hello, great talk, and thank you for that. One of my uses for AI is I'm a podcaster, and I use AI. I have an AI co-host, actually. So I discuss various topics with the AI. I have a social justice background, so I unpack some of those topics. I also attempt to depoliticize when I'm engaging a topic. Why should we be arguing about this at the ballot box when it is a matter of education is sort of the constant cry in a sense. So I wonder, it's a different project than yours. You're taking an internal group and trying to find something internally consistent that matches the members of that group as best as possible. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to inject education and information. Can we check whether we are getting factual and logical statements that make sense from an AI system and propelling ourselves forward that way? So there might be a bump because you're trying to achieve consensus. I'm saying a better educated public may better achieve consensus. It's a different stage or phase in the process almost. I've just laid that out. What's your comment or statement about how that aligns or could mesh, or where is the place for public discourse outside of the consensus process? And how do we bring that in? And do you see a role for AI technology in that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question, right? Kind of like, there are two pillars of our democracy, if you like, right? There is the opportunity for freedom of expression, and then there is the, kind of the grounding of our discourse in kind of like, real observable data and facts and truth, right? And very often these come into conflict, right? When the democratic process is necessarily one which gives equal weight to everyone, including those who don't subscribe to the viewpoints, don't subscribe to, like, what we might say a truthful or legitimate, kind of story about what's actually happening in the world. And so, this has been the challenge of democracy since time immemorial, right? Kind of what are the solutions? I mean, our tool cleaves to this idea that, that we need a tool which is going to kind of fairly aggregate people's views in a way which is going to lead to agreement. The opposite problem of how you educate people, I think language models can also be extremely useful for, as I'm sure you agree. One thing that, I've long wanted to do, this is a project which I hope someone will do, maybe one of you will do it, I would love it if someone would train a language model which would act as a kind of like devil's advocate in debate with the sole purpose of like, kind of improving people's understanding. So whatever you believe, whether it's true or not true, that you have a tool that will kind of give you like a well-informed counter argument, right? And I think that would be immensely valuable because it would teach us all more about the merits of like kind of discourse. It would teach us about how to argue, about how to reason about information. And I think the kind of overall epistemic benefit of that would be significant if you could make it as fun to interact with as it is to, interact with other stuff online. So, both are really important. We've tackled one problem, but I think, the one that you're referencing is equally or more important.
Thanks, Chris. Avery?
Well, I love that devil's advocate idea. So I quite agree that it would be best not to think of AI as an agent at this moment. And you've said we should think of it instead as an institution. My question is echoing a bit some things that were happening in the chat. What role do you see this institution taking in society as it is currently set up, or societies? Because you've named this for Habermas, I guess you're taking for granted that democratic form is going to be kind of at the base. For Habermas, you have two different institutions, one parliamentary deliberative democracy, which issues law, and also second, civil society, where ideas are debated, right? So I'm wondering if you see this form of AI as supplementing one, parliamentary form, two, civil society. It seems more like it's the civil society. Or do you really see this as a third institution? And if so, because you said that social organization is a mechanism design problem, with this third institution of AI, would that in fact naturally risk calling democratic form into question just by being there as a third sort of institution? I know we don't have a lot of time, but if you wouldn't mind speaking on that, thank you.
So that feels like the question which should define, I don't know, the next 30 years, right? I think that is like the most important question. I do not have an answer for you. I could sort of say stuff. I'll maybe fill some of the 4 minutes by saying stuff, but I just want to emphasize that I think that is absolutely the right question, right? What is the form of the institution that AI takes? Who controls it? And is its primary mode of operation one that is going to benefit people or organizations? And I think that is the real dichotomy. I don't even see it so much as like civil society versus, the political process. I think it's really about, at the moment, my view is that we're experiencing a crisis in which people are reacting against the power of large organizations. And I think large organizations, it means both, kind of large corporations, which tend to be bogeymen for people on the left, and governments, which tend to be bogeymen for people on the right, right? And we're experiencing a kind of popular revolt against both of these. And the real question is, how is AI going to play into that? And, there is a story, I think, which is that one of the reasons why we react against large organizations is because we have become enmeshed in their process. And their process, because it's based on old AI and old technology, is primarily rule-based. And it's awful. And it constrains our lives, and it corrals us and curtails us in ways which are deeply detrimental to our fundamental psychological well-being, which fundamentally strives for agency, for self-control, which we are robbed of by this. And it also strives for forms of social interaction, which we're denuded of by the fact that so much of our day-to-day interaction is with algorithms, not with people. And so this presents both an astonishing challenge and astonishing opportunity for AI, right? Because now we have technologies that can actually mimic people. So is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? It could be a good thing because it liberates us from the awful rule-based technologies, which, we wrestle with every day. And you and I wrestle with them, but people who are, kind of much less educated and much less, kind of economically advantaged wrestle with them like far, far, far more. So it could be a benefit, but on the other hand, there's this incredible, risk that because, of course, this technology is built and served by large organizations, and that doesn't matter whether it's like big tech in the West or government in China, we have the opportunity for this to make what is already like the defining problem of our age infinitely worse. I do not know what is going to happen. But I think that is the question that we need to know the answer to.
Avery, thank you for such a wonderful question. And Chris, thank you both for a wonderful answer to that last question, but also for such a stimulating talk and also a stimulating discussion with people. I can tell that we could all stay on a lot longer, but we've taken up enough of your time. Thank you for the generosity of your time, and thank you to everyone. I'm so happy to see that so many people have stayed to the end, and a reminder that for those who had to leave, that there will be some of this will be recorded. So thank you very much, Chris, for the presentation. This concludes our seminar. For those of you who are regular participants, please join us next week on Wednesday, January 22nd, when we welcome Virginia Dignam, who's a professor of computer science at Umea University, for a talk on Beyond the AI Hype, Balancing Innovation and Social Responsibility. And we all look forward to seeing you then. And Chris, again, thank you so much.